Hey everyone, welcome back to Searching the Sacred. Lisa, Steph, and Jason are here with you. This is episode 6 of season 10 of a 7-episode season where we are looking at different gardens throughout Scripture. We've made our way through a handful of gardens in the Hebrew Scriptures, and today we're going to be jumping into a parable from the New Testament, the book of Matthew. But before we dive into that, I just want to highlight one thing really quick. We are doing a celebration for 40 Orchards. We do this annually. It's going to take place on November 13th at Art House North, and we're going to be doing a live podcast recording. So if you are someone who appreciates the work of 40 Orchards, appreciates the podcast Searching the Sacred, and you'd like to join others, meet some people with some common interest, we encourage you to do so, and you can find out more information by going to 40orchards.org. And while you're there, just go ahead and sign up for a study because they're amazing. All right, with all that out of the way, we want to say hi to everybody that's watching this on YouTube. And Lisa is going to be reading from Matthew chapter 13.
Just going to do verses 31 and 32. And I'm reading from the Jewish Annotated New Testament, which uses the NRSV as the translation. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches.
Okay. Simple little parable, right?
Simple, I'm sure. Nothing to say about it. Moving on.
Well, we debated like which parable to use. So really, like for our listeners, you could read Matthew 13 would have a lot to do with seeds and garden, like looking at the conversation to come before, because the parable of the sower is in Matthew 13. This farmer who's like throwing all the seed and some is getting picked up by birds. There's like this one with the wheat and the tares. And so there's a lot of imagery of plants and gardens and farming in this chapter. We decided to hone in on this one that is about a mustard seed. And actually, I'm curious about like our own like history of mustard seed, the three of us. Like, did you ever have a mustard seed necklace? Or like, how was mustard seed talked about? Because mustard seed really shows up in two spots. It's here, but then it's also like faith as small as a mustard seed can move mountains. So it often ends up being like this symbol beyond itself. I had a mustard seed necklace. That's why I'm thinking about it. Did you?
On all honesty, when we were trying to decide on what to call the podcast, we were actually floating around ideas around mustard seed.
We did not, Jason.
No, I'm serious. I actually have images on Canva with like mustard seeds, and because of the whole 40 Orchards and like, you know, growth and vineyard and all that stuff, like I was trying to think organically. I think this was before we even had a conversation. I was like playing with ideas and trying to think.
Maybe you were thinking that, Jason.
I can't picture Lisa ever backing a mustard seed.
Well, no, it got shot down right away. It got shot down so fast, like so fast.
I remember in Sunday school them handing out mustard seeds, but it was always tied to your faith. Like you just need that much faith.
I mean, I literally did a sermon one time at a college I was working at where I had a packet of mustard seeds and then brought out a tree on stage to show like the growth. I mean, you know, illustration and all that jazz.
You did, huh?
Something like that, yeah. Make fun of me
all you want. Did you grow a mustard seed plant or just a random tree?
It was just a random fake tree. Like,
okay.
Yeah, don't worry.
It was going to be really impressive.
I grew it really fast. I waved a wand and Harry Pottered the thing into an actual tree. I mean,
you could prep for a long time.
Prep for a long time. Wouldn't that have been amazing?
I mean, part of why I asked that as a start is because I do think it's one of those passages that can have some baggage with it, depending on how we've been talked to about mustard seeds, which primarily is about the other time Jesus talks about it, which is in Matthew 17:20. And Jesus said to them, if you have faith as a grain of a mustard seed, you will say unto this mountain, move to this place and it shall move. Nothing will be impossible to you. That would be a verse that has sometimes been damaging in people's faith of like, oh, you just must not be praying hard enough to get the thing you want. And so that could be a part of what's coming up in our minds and our hearts and our bodies as we look at a mustard seed in a different context. And it's always good to acknowledge that, to give space for trauma and healing, and then to look with fresh eyes to say, well, what is Jesus saying about mustard seed there? That's another study. And what is Jesus saying about mustard seed here? And how would we view it if we didn't have all that baggage attached to it? So if you just start with just a surface reading of what we heard today and pretended we've never heard sermons on it or had someone bring out a tree as he was talking, what sticks out to you as you hear this parable?
I think it's just that note in the beginning that he put before them another parable tells me that this is not like just a one-off conversation. There's lots of things that have come before that, like, I'm in a train of something. So I'm actually curious if it's meant to be read alone or if it would be more helpful if you actually like pulled into all the other conversation that's happening in this. Oftentimes it's helpful to slow down and go really narrow, but I also like am
Right.
It's a clearly noted. There's another one.
Right.
Here's
Well,
another
and
parable.
it's that common phrase of the kingdom of heaven is like, right? Or the kingdom of God is like ... Like this chapter has a number of those, and those are not uncommon for what Jesus is doing, which is kind of interesting because I think we like to simplify things as much as we possibly can, and especially Christians, we like to be as clear and concise and solid and secure in all of our answers about who is God, what is Jesus, the Holy Spirit, church, the Bible. We like to have concrete ideas that we don't ever have to think about again. And yet Jesus is like trying to explain the kingdom of God and is like, well, it's like this, man. It's like this, and it's like this, and it's like this. And by the way, none of this is like concrete, like lists. These are just parables, stories, ideas, things for you to wrestle with and ponder. Like, so there's never like a clarity. It's more like an invitation.
I love that. There's never a clarity. It's an invitation, because I think sometimes part of the baggage we have with this passage is also related to parables, that parables have often been framed to people as some sort of like an Aesop's fable. There's some sort of clear message that you can walk away with, when actually parables as a teaching technique was the opposite. It was something that Jesus was leaning into, this tradition that Jewish religious leaders had of telling stories. And I'm blanking out on the Hebrew word for it right now. I'll find it before the end of the podcast. Where the intention actually wasn't to be clear. The intention was to be frustrating or confusing or thought-provoking. Because the idea of this, Jesus is speaking to a crowd and he wants to give them something to talk about on the way home. Parables are meant to be an invitation to get curious about that thing that wasn't quite right, that thing that bothered you, that thing that like flipped something on its head, and to invite you to talk about it, to think about it, to wrestle with it. That if a parable feels clear, this comes. Amy Jill Levine has a great book on the parables, and I'm 99% sure this comes from either her idea or maybe it's even a quote of, if a parable feels clear, then you've read it wrong. You've missed the thing that would be for you, make you angry or confused if you were in the context.
Yeah, I heard I think I actually heard this on, maybe it was an NPR politics podcast or something, or it was not in like a kind of Christian circle space, but it was about this pastor who is encouraging the people that he is leading that the whole mission of the church is to comfort the afflicted and then to afflict the comfortable. And that kind of is that idea that I'm kind of mulling over, like with parables, like it kind of takes those in power and says like, are you sure you're doing it the way you're supposed to?
Okay, I I found a passage from the book and I have to read it right now, Jason, because this is amazing. So this is a direct quote from Amy Jill Levine's Parables book. Religion has been defined and designed to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. We do well to think of the parables of Jesus as doing the afflicting. Therefore, if we hear a parable and think, I really like that, or worse, fail to take any challenge, we are not listening well enough.
I mean, unless you're in the position of having been like the afflicted, right? If you need comforting, maybe a parable of Jesus actually is a little bit of a balm, because maybe it is speaking the truth that you've been longing to hear, like that this small little thing that gets buried in the ground will actually one day become something better or more, because maybe you do feel like the mustard seed, but so maybe there is I'm not trying to disrupt the excitement around the great Amy Jill Levine, but I wonder if it's like if you do get excited by a parable, could there be an avenue where it's because you feel like it's empowering of the station that you're in. Anyway.
I
feel like,
go ahead.
One thing, they're subversive, which is what, like, it seems like parables kind of have an invitation to considering how subversive God might be in the world.
Mm-hmm. Then
what it says about your position or how you are, that you would hope for subversion. Mm-hmm. So I think I don't know that they give you comfort in the parable in and of itself, but the idea that there could be something subversive happening or something surprising happening might be really welcoming when things feel really difficult or complicated or hard. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's just like a little bit of hope that's like locked in there.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I don't know, it felt really transformative to me when I learned it. And I don't exactly know why, so we'll maybe flesh this out. That Jesus wasn't inventing something when he started speaking in parables. Like, I sourced it with Jesus, but actually it was a rabbinic religious technique. And it's in rabbinic documents that come after Jesus, but are sourced before Jesus, with the very form, I will tell you, Mshal, a parable, mashal, to what can a thing be compared? To say there's something about Jesus being a part of a stream of something that that also feels differently subversive to me, like giving him the proper amount of credit for this teaching technique. I don't know why that felt really different or important, but it did to me and there's something subversive in that to me, of like, maybe it's this. I feel like Christians often end up operating in such a way where they feel like they always need to reinvent the wheel and do things like instead of trusting the community food shelf and stocking the community food shelf, we will create a food shelf at our church. Now, not that a food shelf is bad, but this sense of like, where can I come alongside or use something that already exists? And to say, like, Jesus was stepping into streams that existed before him, and that doesn't make them lesser. I think it actually elevates them. It helps us see a little bit more clearly that is a teaching method that is subversive, and that subversive thing is going to affect us in some way. I don't know, it gives us a framework a little bit.
There's I don't even know where this began, but there's like a specialness that is kind of baked into Western Christianity. Like, we need to be the special ones. And maybe it's like right from the Bible, like, you are set apart, right? Like that idea of being holy, right? And so, like, as the set apart ones, everything has to be like super special. So, like, yes, our Christian adjectival use, our Christian music is better than actual music, right? Our Christian universities are better than other universities. Our Christian food shelf is better than the other food shelf, right? Like, our Christian, whatever is always better. Like, our Jesus is better than any other teacher. Our Jesus is better than anything. And like, I'm not trying to negate Jesus as like God or anything, but like, the idea of like,
Be careful, you're a pastor, Jason.
well, but I mean, like, but it gets to your point of saying like, there's no way that Jesus was ever a part of a stream of teaching, because Jesus was singularly special, just like the rest of us are singularly special because we're a part of the Jesus Club, as opposed to like, Jesus was trying to be in a model of what it meant to be human in like a bringing together of the divine and the human, of the dust and the spirit, and like helping us get back to that. And it's not quote unquote special. It's what it's always supposed to be. And so stop seeing yourself as anything other than what it's supposed to be. So you have to actually have the humility to serve the world. And you don't have to have a label of Christian in order to do that.
So should we think more about this particular parable then?
Let's do it.
He put forth another parable, saying unto them, the kingdom of heaven is like. I mean, that's really the starting point. And that is that parable form that we were just talking about.
So I guess I'm kind of curious if we could just break down a few words, and like,
yeah.
This is where I think your all's knowledge and ability to dive into text and language would be really helpful. So like, there's a couple of words at the very beginning that can be triggering for people, or just be, like flyover country for people. So the kingdom of heaven, right? Like that's in a lot of parables. It's in a lot of phrasing of Jesus. Some people get offended by the idea of a kingdom because it's a, obviously a masculine concept. We're not talking about a queendom. We're talking about a kingdom. So there's a patriarchy built into that, which feels a little hard when it's Jesus maybe reinforcing it. There's also this idea of heaven. So what's going on there? Is heaven, a distant place that's like above the clouds or something? Or is, what are we talking about when we use the word heaven? Or what is Jesus maybe implying when we use the word heaven? So I think those two terms alone would be interesting to like get us going, because the rest of the parable is kind of meant to be helping explain those two things.
I mean, what do we think of when we think of kingdom? Like at its base, what's a kingdom? Think about a place where there's a ruler and therefore laws that come from that ruler. Is that fair? It's like at its base, and vague descriptions of a kingdom. I'm kind of thinking of that, like how would you describe what a kingdom is by itself before we attach something else to it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a defined place of authority of one entity over the rest. So we're not saying it's a defined place. So a kingdom has borders. It has an expectation of where the ownership of this thing ends and where it begins. Like there's a border, and its authority is in the possession of one entity, not a plurality. It's not the democracy. It's not the Senate. It's not the Congress. It's not the Republic. It's the kingdom, right? It's a singular individual who is ruling or having authority over everything within that domain, right? That space, that defined area.
Lisa, did you have a further thought on that, or are you doing something else?
No, I mean, I'm just thinking that they feel really linked to me. So like to separate, like if I think of like kingdom, I don't know, like in some ways that feels like if we limit it too much to this idea of like a singular ruler making rules, it doesn't necessarily then hold that it's made up of people And like, there's a lot happening inside of it. Like if I'm a part of a kingdom, that's where I live, it's where I work, it's where I reside, like I'm a part of that. I mean, if I
Yeah.
happen to rule the kingdom, that's probably a different experience, but like that's not, most of us aren't in that. And
Mhm.
so it feels like in some ways that this kingdom of heaven, and if we take heaven, I don't know, like sometimes I feel like heaven gets a lot of like ties up some stuff of like where you go when you die kind of conversations that I grew up with. But if I just think of it as like, as it's, I mean, one of the definitions is like vaulted expanse, which like it just, for me, it feels like it's like everything we are in now. Like this is
Mhm.
like everything that's a part of that vaulted expanse is us.
Mhm.
And so like it's the kingdom of the whole thing.
Well, I think that ties so beautifully into why I actually wanted to start with kingdom first, is to say, like, it's a part of what Jesus is blowing up by saying kingdom of heaven. So, like, a kingdom has a meaning outside kingdom of heaven. And it is really the idea of it's basilia, which we can hear like things like basilica comes from that, but it's basilia. And the word for king is basilius. So it's like the land of the king. And so it is both things. It is the place the king rules, but really the kingdom could be considered a dominion of that king's leadership. But that means if it's a dominion, it's a place where people live their lives. It is a home, it is a workplace, it is a place I reside and live under the rules of. And I think about, like, if Jesus were to appear right now and tell a parable, he probably wouldn't call it the kingdom of heaven. He would probably call it the government of heaven or the
Republic
nation of
of.
heaven. I don't know, like, it'd be some word that captures like the place you live, and the society, maybe the society of the society you live under. There's a place where that's true of all of us, but then he's helping people think about the whole thing differently by then tying it to heaven, right? So you already think about yourself as living in the kingdom of Rome. Fine. You live in that kingdom, but also let's think about the kingdom of heaven, which is bigger than Rome. There's a bigger dominion you're living under. And there's a different way to live in that dominion and to live in that society.
Well, I think it's interesting because, like Lisa alluded to, we often think of heaven, especially with potentially if you grew up in a Christian environment, you likely have heard like that's where you go when you die, or that's the hope of where you go when you die, or all that. Like, and yet the way you both are describing it, it's less about what happens when you die, but it's more about a more expansive space in which we reside now. And it doesn't have the defining markers that we would normally, you know, put on ourselves, right? Like I'm a Minnesotan, I'm an American, I'm you know, like I live in New Brighton, right? Like, define different markers of my place, right? I'm a white male, right? Like those could be markers of place too. Like so um whereas like heaven in the way you're describing it is expanding, but it's not expanding in the sense of like, well, one day you'll be a part of it, like when you pass on and your soul goes to be with God, but you're already a part of this more expansive understanding of what it means to be in a space or in a society or in a nation or in a community.
Mhm.
And I think that's an interesting twist because I don't think it's a twist. I think it's probably a more accurate understanding of what heaven is meant to be understood as.
Well, right, because the word itself is Uranos. I'm probably saying my Greek pronunciation is worse than my Hebrew pronunciation, so everybody fact check me.
Don't worry, season 11, we'll get there.
But to Lisa's point, it's vaulted expanse, but it also can be translated like the universe, the world. It's something beyond. It comes from oros, which is mountain. So it's the idea, like if you're standing, it's the thing that's bigger than where you are. It's the thing that's above where you are. That's not actually oriented at all towards past, present, future tense. It's oriented towards bigness. So it's not an afterwards. It's this thing that's bigger than you, bigger than us. And I think that, like, I think about this also with the word eternity, which Jesus doesn't use here, but it feels connected to the conversation of when we hear words like eternal life, we've been taught to hear that that's after I die. But eternity, by its very definition, is outside of time.
Yeah.
It is something that existed before me and will still exist after me. So the way that we orient it to a later time is actually a misunderstanding of the word eternity itself. And how does the same thing happen with the word heaven, where there's some timestamp that we put on it that's not like the same word heaven is used when Jesus is baptized, and a voice from heaven talks to Jesus, a voice from beyond.
Yeah. Well, we would never say that's a voice from the future, right?
But we think of heaven as future.
But we would say it's a place that we all hope to go to, right? We still, because it's a voice, quote, from heaven, we think that there is another realm that we are supposed to go to, as opposed to this larger expanse of place. There's a voice from that speaking into this definable moment. Yeah. It kind of breaks our brains a little bit.
Well, and I think too, there's some of it. I guess I don't think of heaven as potential. I don't think of it as
Get the tires, Lisa.
If I'm allowing it to be something that we go to, I don't think of it as future. I think of it as like anybody who's dead is there, because like that's how there's a lot of comfort, and like they're in heaven now.
Yeah.
And so like there is an understanding, I think, of heaven being maybe outside of time or always in time, or I'm not sure if that's maybe
which is funny, because we all love the passage when Paul's like, the great cloud of witnesses, right, is like cheering us on and encourage you to finish the race. And that's not like from the future speaking back into the present. We imagine that like being a cacophony of sound as you are like currently living life, but that just makes us really uncomfortable when we start actually breaking it down like that.
Yeah, I think it's good to pause and notice, have I thought about how the things I've been told to do or don't go together, and what that's done to how I think about God and myself? Right? That we're taught, we sometimes have these contradictions that we haven't really faced, that if we faced them would lead to something better, deeper, to say, oh, how is it true that I've been told my whole life that heaven is after something? But yet I've also been told that there's people who are watching me now. How do those go together, and what do we do with that? And there's a way that this becomes a part of what Jesus is having people wrestle with. What is the kingdom of heaven, actually? Where is it? What is it? When does it start? What do you compare it to?
Let me ask you this question. Would his original hearers have struggled with this the way that we're struggling with it now, like 2,000 years later, with all of the Western captivity of the theological understanding of this? Like, we've like defined this and analyzed this and like created timelines and judgment days and raptures and all this, end time stuff. And like, we've done so much stuff to this that now we can't help but have all of that meeting us in this moment when we say the kingdom of heaven is like. Whereas like his original hearers, I mean, they didn't have like rapture theology in mind. They didn't have timelines. They didn't have like,
they hadn't read the Left Behind series.
They had not read Left Behind. They didn't know there was going to be a beast coming up out of the waters or the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Like, they didn't know that yet, right? Like we do. We are so convinced of that. Anyway, I just wonder what they like when they heard kingdom of heaven, if they were like, oh yeah, bigger idea of what it means to be human, bigger thing that we belong to than just, Jerusalem or Rome or whatever.
I think, I don't pretend to be a New Testament scholar. I don't pretend to be a first century scholar. So like, take everything I say about anything like this with a grain of salt. But I do want to give a couple footholds for like things that we get stuck in that would just be different, that maybe affect how we hear Jesus's words. One is the Hebrew context for the afterlife is very different than all of those things. And so one of the contexts that they would have would be that, which is there is more of this concept of Sheol, which is a place where all people go when they die. that is going to have a very different understanding of the afterlife. So that's like one piece that's different, where heaven isn't going to be language they use for the afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
So like that part's different. But the kingdom piece, I think, is also interesting when we think about the two contexts for kingdom that they would understand. One is this kingdom of Rome and Roman rule, but the other is this desire for the restoration of the kingdom of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And the desire to have a king once again and a land that's theirs once again. And you could also think about them having this context of what they actually are desiring and whether that's what Jesus is offering.
Mm-hmm.
If they're desiring the kingdom of Israel and he's offering them the kingdom of heaven, and how are those things not the same? So it'd be like a second context piece. A third context that I think I've been more aware of in recent years, thanks to the people at the Bible for Normal People, is that some of the context is also Greco-Roman gods and Greco-Roman understanding of the afterlife, and that there's a way that Jesus would be speaking to that like people would have, Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey 750 years before Jesus was born.
Mm-hmm.
People are seeped in concepts that are in the Iliad and the Odyssey as a part of their culture. And so that gives them a particular thought about the afterlife that could also be a part of the context that Jesus is trying to open up when Jesus talks about something like the kingdom of heaven. So those would be the contexts that I would keep in mind.
Yeah. That's good. So
And
more Homer in the Iliad than the Left Behind series. Okay, got it.
And also really this desire for, I think one of the things that's really resonant across time and space is to say, what am I desiring? And is that what Jesus is offering? One of the things they'd be desiring is a restored kingdom of Israel.
Yeah.
And Jesus keeps talking about a present tense kingdom of heaven. And there's a way that would be disappointing and frustrating.
Yeah.
Not because it's caught up into these after I die questions, but because it's not solving my present tense oppression.
Yeah. He doesn't say the kingdom of Israel is like.
Mm-hmm.
He says the kingdom of heaven is like, which is ironic because in American politics, we'll often hear America is like a city on a hill, which is not meant to be connected to like a actual nation, right? It's not
right.
That city of the hill language was more in line with like this kingdom of heaven language, as opposed to like the nation of Israel is supposed to be a city on a hill. It was meant like y'all who follow this way of being in the world are like a city on a hill, and it doesn't need to be defined by a border. It doesn't need to be defined by a king or doesn't need to be defined by a president or a military. And yet we like to use that language because it gets our base riled up and excited. Okay, Lisa. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, Lisa's been like, I got a feeling
she's stewing on something.
I know that is the best word for it. Stewing. Lisa, bubble over, please.
Well, I'm kind of like wondering, like, what's the question? It feels like a parable is meant to like not necessarily answer a question, but there's a question that comes before it. Like, why is Jesus just shooting off about the kingdom of? Are people asking about the kingdom of heaven? What are they asking about? And if I go back into the like earlier in the chapter, like before the thing starts, there is like this weird conversation about like the disciples asking, why do you speak in parables? And Jesus has kind of a funky answer. And I don't know that we're trying to get into all of it, but I'm like, I feel like this tension of like, what is like, do people just randomly shoot off a parable if they're not trying to actually say something? Like, and if they're trying to say something, it feels like then there's a question or a problem or something that's unsettled. And
I think it's worth. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to expand on what you were saying. So in chapter 12, Jesus keeps making people mad. And I think that's worth noting that, but as we get into chapter 13, that like his disciples are eating on the Sabbath and the Pharisees question him on that. And then he rebukes the Pharisees. And then he talks about like his changed relationships with his brother and mother. And so it's like he's doing something really disruptive and not doing what people expected or hoped for. And then he starts speaking in parables. Now, it's also worth noting that Luke is who places them in this, or sorry, Matthew, not Luke. Matthew is the one who places them in this order. It might not actually have happened on the heels of each other. Like it could be that Jesus was told this parable often, wherever he went. And Matthew's the one who places it in chapter 13 of how he tells the story. But Jesus might have told the parable of the mustard seed like 30 times for people to like keep thinking about it. And so the context could be varied, even that he keeps talking about this. Why does he keep talking about this? And I think maybe what we can do there is there's things we can't know about the backstory, but there are things we can see that he's saying and wonder about, like for that idea of like what in here is frustrating or subversive. So the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, which someone took and sowed it in their field, which indeed is the least of all the seeds, but when grown, it's the greatest. So we've heard language like this before from Jesus of least and greatest. But I feel like there's a few questions we can ask. Why mustard seed? Could have picked any seed, any plant. Why mustard seed? Why, when talking about a kingdom, is the entire chapter of 13 talking about a garden as we're in this parable? Like he's talking about a kingdom, and in none of them is he talking about buildings. He's talking about farmers and seeds and plants and yeast and bread. And then there's one where it's like a treasure in a field, but it's still a field. Like none of the kingdom parables in chapter 13 have buildings and princes and language you'd expect there. So why the field? And why this least to greatest and birds of the air coming to lodge? And what might that reveal about what was behind him telling the parable, to Lisa's point of like, what was behind this? Why was he telling this kind of parable?
It's a good question.
Any thoughts on that so far? All right, how about I'll just start putting a couple of things out. Mustard seeds are neither the smallest seeds nor the biggest plants. It's not true. And they're part of the world. It's like there are smaller. So yes, a mustard seed is small. It's not the smallest. And it really doesn't grow into a tree. It grows into a bush.
Mm-hmm.
So the language is a bit problematic of Jesus is either lying or making a different point than we sometimes make it. Because it doesn't grow into a tree. It doesn't become the biggest. It becomes big, but it's really like a large bush.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
No, I'm like drawing such a blank. Like I kind of feel like I'm one of the people that like heard this at like a gathering in some field somewhere, and I have like a 4-mile walk home, and I'm gonna need to talk about it for a while. And then you just happen to hit record on a podcast, and now I'm like, I don't know where to start. And so, yeah, I'm trying to put myself in that position of like hearing it and being like, well, it's not the smallest and it's not the biggest, so why would he say that? I don't know.
Well, and maybe maybe it's good you said that out loud, because that is then getting at the hope of a parable. On the way home, people are like, why did he say it that way?
Yeah.
And why is someone sowing mustard? Mustard grows wild along the side. There's mustard plants right there. There's mustard plants right there. Why would someone be sowing mustard? Because that part's weird too. People didn't farm it, didn't really have to farm it. It grew wild. You could. It's not a common thing to farm.
So, okay, so it's not a common thing to farm. It's not actually the smallest and it's not actually the biggest. And yet it's being portrayed as something that you have to do intentionally, that it's something that is the smallest, which, you know, maybe identifies with the weakest and the poorest and the most marginalized. Then it becomes the biggest, which in this context is the most capable of providing safety and shelter, as opposed to becoming the biggest, so now we're the toughest and the strongest, right? It's like it's more a benevolent use of power as opposed to an oppressive use of power. I'm making a lot of quick generalizations here that we could go into much further. But I think it goes back to Lisa's question of like, what spurred on this whole litany of parables about the kingdom of heaven is like ... Because like he says to the disciples earlier in the chapter, something around like, I speak in parables because those that like, there are some that can't see, and there's some that can't hear, and there's some like, and it's almost like I gotta get them, and I'm not gonna get them by just telling them. Like, I'm not just gonna be able to tell them the truth, because it doesn't work that way for anybody. And so I gotta do it this way so that they can start to see maybe, and that they can start to hear maybe. Because if I don't do it this way, they're never gonna have a chance at getting it. To not make a overtly political comment.
You always say you're not going to make overly political comments, and then you do, Jason.
But like, I do that, but then it's like I'm qualifying what I'm about to say. I get it, whatever. Okay. Facts in our time are completely under attack. You can have studies and scientific studies, and you can actually have facts, and then people are like, well, I don't believe you, or I don't believe your source because it comes from this type of, and it's like I don't know what to tell you. Like, I almost wonder if that's what Jesus is like. I could just tell them the way it is, but they're just not going to believe it. And so I'm gonna confound them a little bit with this like parable thing, where they have to like go, what the hell? Like, okay, like that was weird. But maybe he's actually onto something, you know? I don't know.
I mean, if I look at the translation, like smallest is one of the options, but it's also like the language of least. And which feels like when we're talking like the least and the greatest, feels like that's a conversation that has been happening over the course and will continue to be happening. Like the conversation of who is the greatest. And so it feels almost like the weightiness of the seed potentially, of that you assumed that this thing that has no worth or is the least is able to produce something that is impressive for what it's doing.
Ooh, I love the way you said that. This thing
Me
you
too.
assumed was of little worth is impressive for what it's doing. Is that how you just said it?
Yeah.
Because that shows why, like, the smallest, like, again, back to that like subversive nature of it. When we just think he's talking about physical smallness, we would miss that idea. And so if we say, oh, actually, it's not the physical smallness and it's not the physical bigness, but there is something about this least and great. Like maybe it's not that it's physically small, though it is, but it's also that it's just common and it's ordinary and it's
unassuming.
Yeah. And that like you wouldn't think this unassuming least seed could do something great, but in the kingdom of heaven, it's the least seeds who do the greatest things. And that's upside down. That's subversive. It's saying in the kingdom of heaven, it's the least that becomes the most powerful. Which again, that's right in line with how Jesus talks about things like John the Baptist just a couple chapters before.
I like that.
I think there's also something to that it becomes great doing something unexpected. So like you would think a mustard seed would become great by producing the most mustard. But it becomes great because it becomes a tree that the birds of the field can nest in. That's like a surprising turn in the parable. Like that's not the point of the plant. That's not what the farmer expected to sow.
Well, and it kind of goes back to your, could go back to your idea of he's not saying the kingdom of Israel is like, he's saying the kingdom of heaven is like. And if the mustard seed is a great mustard tree because it produces a lot of mustard, that's like saying America's great because it's going to have a lot of great Americans, right? As opposed to saying America's great because it welcomes the immigrant and we become a more diverse people with more understanding and celebration of difference, and that makes us a more thoughtful and dynamic people. And so I wonder if like the kingdom of heaven, by sheltering the birds, is trying to make some statement about like, get beyond just yourselves, y'all.
Mm-hmm.
See, I didn't apologize for being political with that one. Just wanted to point that out.
I mean, do we see ourselves as the person planting the seed or as the seed?
Say more. Great question.
Well, it like in the parable, it has that there's someone took it and sowed in his field the seed, mustard seed. And so like I'm trying to is Jesus saying like God did that? That's what that is. God's sowing little mustard seeds. That's you. Or is it like this is the activity that you should be looking like? Is this what we're supposed to be looking for? Like are we planting mustard seeds? Are we doing things that are subversive? Or like who's responsible for the subversive nature of the mustard seed?
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
Like, is it miraculous that it turned into the tree?
Mm-hmm.
Could you like, because it's not like you can plan for that. Because a mustard bush
Yeah, it's what's
is
interesting
not
about
a
the
tree.
right. And I would say that's one of the through lines to all of the parables in Matthew 13 is there's a little bit of chaos. There's a little bit like the sower is sowing his seed everywhere. Some of it's going on rocks, some of it's going in like it's not. And then there's this wheat and tares where there's weeds growing right in the middle of the field. And here there's a mustard seed becoming a tree, which is not what it's supposed to become. There's a little bit of unpredictability, unexpectedness, lack of control and kingdom and walls and rules and order. There's a little bit of wildness, perhaps, to the kingdom of heaven. And what does that mean for us? Are we the seed? Are we the person sowing the seed? And how do we handle all these unexpected things that are happening as a part of how the kingdom of heaven operates?
Or are we the birds?
Or are we the birds?
Like we're nesting. I don't know.
I love that idea of like the mustard plant is a shrub and Jesus is saying it becomes a tree, and that would be like, okay, A, it's not the smallest, B, it's not the biggest, and C, it's not actually a tree. At some level, there's like a level there's like Jesus is saying like, hey, I'm gonna invite you to use your imagination a little bit, right? Like it's like Jack and the Beanstalk suddenly, right? Like I'm gonna plant this thing and it's gonna become a magic stalk that goes up into another realm for you. Like, you know, it's like inviting into like fantasy land, and like, you know, not so much like, you know, you're going off or whatever, you know, in a Narnia or something, but like it's like this. You can't just think of this logically anymore because mustard seeds don't become trees.
Well, I wonder
You
if,
know?
if we, whether or not we are the farmer or the seed there, I wonder how this is an invitation, back to using your word invitation, to allow the unexpected to happen. Like live with an imagination
Exactly.
beyond what you can control and look for where there's life.
But isn't that what we do with people all the time? Is we say, here's a person, this is what they're capable of becoming. And we put a cap on it, right? And so it's like, here's a mustard seed and it's going to become a shrub. But what if that isn't actually the case? What if Jesus is saying, actually, that's a person and they're going to become a whole lot more than you ever anticipated? and it's going to feel miraculous to you, or it's going to look completely impossible, but that's actually the way that this has been designed. That's actually the way this is supposed to be. You just don't have the imagination and the creativity to see it that way. That's your limitation.
The other thing that I think could be potentially a subversive angle here that I want to throw into play is about mustard itself. Because again, Jesus could have picked any small seed becoming something big and unexpected. And that the Greeks, we think of mustard as like, I don't know, what's our preferred mustard brands that we put on our hot dogs? We think of it as a condiment. So the Greeks use mustard as both a condiment and a medicine. Pythagoras prescribed it for scorpion stings, and Hippocrates used it as medicine plasters. The Romans used mustard to treat war wounds and spread it on open cuts. So this other potential thing here would be to say you don't normally farm mustard. Mustard grows wild. If someone's farming mustard, there's this potential that they're farming it for Roman soldiers because they'd be using it as medicine. And if that's the case, now that's an if, that's a few conjectures. This is what we're talking about on the way home. Why would someone be farming mustard? What if it's for the Romans? And then what? I'm just throwing out there, does that create a subversive thread of this person intends to farm this medicine for soldiers? And it becomes a tree where birds come. Lisa, you looked up like you maybe had a thought, but I don't know if you're just thinking a thought or if it means nothing to you.
Well, I was just wrestling with whether Jesus would be divisive. And then I was like, I think I don't want him to be divisive, but I think there are times where he's divisive.
Just in the chapter before, he said that you got to leave your brothers and mothers.
Yeah. So like there's this interesting thing of like how I think I want Jesus to be. And so like I probably take that into the narratives because I think I'm tired of all the division and everything. Like, is there not a freaking meet in the middle? Is there not a I don't know. Feels like for all humanity, we're always just got to be against something, someone, something. And I would like it to be more of a, gosh, you guys should just love each other. That was what that was the random thought of like, God, would he be saying something about Rome? Because Jesus doesn't do anything about Rome. So why... He doesn't do anything about the kingdom of Israel either. He doesn't do anything about a lot of things. Honestly, I mean, that felt like a big tire kick.
That's true.
There's just a lot that's not done.
It's a funny tire kick because it's also like, oh yeah, I guess you're right. Like, yeah.
Well, even this parable is not saying much. There's none. I mean, like, okay, so someone plants something and it becomes something unexpected.
Like if I'm the bird, maybe I feel good about like, how that means there's like a really nice, like in the kingdom of heaven, there's these miraculous little homes that we get to live in. That feels like provision. That feels like God caring about the birds. I can hear that through line. And if I'm the sower, like it feels maybe like whatever you sow has the potential for provision. Like the kingdom of heaven is just like, if you're doing the sowing, you're going to have amazing things happening. But those are all feel goods. That's not agitating me. That doesn't feel subversive. That just makes me feel like I like it. So like my brain wants to make it something I like instead of the challenge of like, what is the challenge? What is the thing that I should be wrestling with? Because I know that I'm not in a place of oppression. Like I live in the wealthiest country in the world. I'm a part of the wealthy. If I'm comparing myself to the rest of the world, like I'm sitting in the places of all kinds of privilege. I feel like I probably should be challenged by this kind of parable, but I'm not sure what I should be challenged with.
Hmm.
I wonder about hearing it with the one that I wonder about the challenge for all of us of letting go of control and really recognizing what is and isn't ours to do and how challenging that is. I don't know if I'd use the word subversive for it, but I would use the word challenging of like in the parable before, the humans really want to pick the weeds, but they can't because you can't tell the difference between the wheat and the weeds until it gets to full grown height. And so basically the parable saying like, don't stop trying to do that. Just take care of your field. Let it be what it is. And for this to be on the heels of that is a little like, you're going to go ahead and sow that seed thinking it's going to be one thing, but also you're not actually in control of what it becomes. So your job is to plant the stupid seed. And if God decides to make that seed into a tree where birds come and live, great. That's what the kingdom of heaven is like. And there's a way that's abundance, but there's also, it would be frustrating to the sower, right? That's not what he thought he was planting or she thought she was planting. And there's something in those of like, and even in the next one with the yeast, like it's all out of control of the person. Like this little bit of yeast creates all of this bread. That actually means a lot of work for the person kneading the bread. It's like hundreds of pounds of bread to knead. Like, oh, shoot, that's not what I thought would happen. And the abundance is actually annoying. The greatness creates work that I didn't expect to have. The birds are going to plant all sorts of mustard seeds where I didn't intend them to be planted. I wanted to just put it, if I'm the farmer sowing mustard, I just wanted that mustard to be in my garden so I could make money from the Romans. And now there's birds nesting in its branches, which means they're going to eat all that mustard seed and they're going to distribute that mustard seed everywhere. Suddenly there's an abundance of mustard seed and the Romans don't need me anymore. Like there's this like abundance that creates a lack of control on my part.
So this is a parable about the end of capitalism.
Yeah. I don't know. Something, right? That feels like a challenge to me, right? Like, can you plant but release what the thing you plant becomes? And you plant where birds might come and live in the thing you planted and freely distribute what you took so much care in cultivating. Because I might want to just keep all that mustard in my little field, but now if birds are there, it's going to go everywhere. That's actually going to be disruptive to the way I want to farm my mustard. That's a challenge to me. There are times where I'm like, feel competitive about people doing similar things to what I'm doing in the world and being like, wait a second. That's in my field. Can you change your language about that a little bit to sound less like copyright infringement? Maybe that's just Steph's application live in the moment. Maybe else's. I feel the challenge of birds pooping out the seeds that I took such care to plant. I want them just to be in my field. I don't want them to be everywhere. Feels messy and annoying, even though it also leads to more mustard, which is the thing I wanted in the first place.
No, but I think that's something, especially if we're going to talk about like church world, church life, church things. And like not to come after the mega church, but also to the challenge of like, why do we always want people to come to our thing, right? The win is actually that we get so big and everybody comes to our thing. Not that everybody finds their place. Like what we're not trying to do is actually for everybody to find their place. We want them to come to ours. Come to this one, join me here. And then going to be shown how to do things the right way. And I think some of it comes from like the lived tension of being taught that this is the way you read it. This is the only way you read it. This is the answer. This is what you do. And then meeting somebody who's like, well, there's another way. Then they tell you their way and you're like, oh, that kind of makes sense. And then you meet another person who's like, well, I kind of see it this way. And you're like, oh, hey, okay. like I learned such a narrow perspective on everything, and then and there's a way that like the narrow perspective keeps you in, but maybe that's just not. I mean, I feel like if all the birds are living in your trees, maybe you don't care so much about it being it is more messy. And is it about the care of the birds or about tending the bush or like getting the mustard?
I think it's really interesting that concept of like not worrying, not spending all your time worrying about the results and if you are benefiting or if the good is just happening out there now and it's beyond your control. You know, I had a situation where a few years ago there was a pastor of a local Methodist community that closed, and the pastor very intentionally met with each of the families and like gave them the name of a church that she thought they would feel a good fit with. And a few of the families she indicated to come to my church up in, Shoreview. And so I met with the families and talked to them, and it's just been an awesome fit. We've just enveloped them. They're in leadership positions now. I mean, it's just been awesome to have them be a part of it. Well, she got reassigned to another church like 15 minutes down the road from me. And what hasn't happened is she hasn't gone and like told everybody to come back, or to like, hey, now I have another church and I'm only 15 minutes away. You should come back to be with me. It's kind of like she saw that there was like this thing that was about to die, but there was new life that could come and needed to happen. And she just let it happen and trusted that what's good is going to be good, and it just needs to be good. And that was enough for her. And I've always felt so grateful because I didn't do anything to earn those families' trust. I mean, I did eventually, but they trusted someone else first. And that was such a beautiful, abundant mindset, I thought. And yeah, it's just been a cool, and she and I have been in similar circles, and it's been fun to just talk about like how people are thriving and how they're doing in community. And there's just an excitement that we just share. It's not like a competitive thing. It's just like wow, isn't this neat to see how this transpired? Anyway, it just, the way you were framing the tree and the birds just kind of reminded me of that idea.
Oh yeah, I think maybe that's where we kind of start drawing together this closing of like, if that seems resonant with all three of us, some measure of, can we let go of control of what the thing is becoming and just focus on where there is life? Because the kingdom of heaven is about this expansive, abundant,
imaginative,
available thing. And how might that play out in our day-to-day if we focus on that over the control?
This has been a 40 Orchards podcast. At 40 Orchards, our mission is to create circles for all people to wrestle through biblical texts so that together we can expand each other's experience of what is sacred, whole, and good. We search through the lens of sacred possibility, assuming there is more to be discovered, questioned, and applied as we listen for how God is still speaking. You can learn more about 40 Orchards and sign up for a study by going to 40orchards.org. Our opening music is by LesFM. Our closing music is by NCR Music Vibes. Additional music is by 3 Music. Any references to books or other sources can be found in the show notes of this episode. Thank you for searching the sacred.